Well, I want to welcome everyone to RP Book Club. This is our final session on Randy's book, and we have Randy himself with us tonight to answer our questions. Okay,
so we are going over chapter 6 and 7 of the book here from Dr. Randy Wray, Making Money Work for Us, How MMT Can Save America. Chapter 6, the MMT Alternative Framework for Policy, and Chapter 7, MMT and Policy. I want to give a little disclaimer. This is a great book, and one of the things I really enjoy about Dr. Wray is he breaks everything down to the lowest common denominator. Like, he makes it so simple to understand this stuff, and that's the beauty of MMT, is it simplifies and demystifies a lot of the economic gobbledygook we're taught to believe. But MMT, from what I understand, one of the basic policies that it proposes is the job guarantee, because it satisfies that need to pay taxes. It kind of completes the circuit, if I'm understanding it right. And it calls for a job guarantee, and really, in general, public spending, and understanding that we don't need to have like a profit motive, a return on investment, or, executives and CEOs, or need to find an investor that wants to take a risk on transportation or healthcare or whatever. MMT is telling us that we can do this. And it's almost like every page of this book I read, I'm thinking to myself that everything that MMT or the MMT advocates are proposing is diametrically opposed to the interests of private capital and wanting to privatize everything for a profit. And it's almost like, if you believe that Congress has been captured by the rich and the ownership class, and it's against Congress's interests to admit MMT, or to say, yeah, I understand it, we understand it, because it's going against the will of their donors. This really breaks everything down, and it gives the nuance of how things are paid for in monetary policy, and really simplifies it in a way that a child could understand. And I think there's an illustrated book coming out pretty soon. Maybe we can even get libertarians to understand this stuff, because I don't think we can hold our politicians' feet to the fire personally. But I believe that if more people that think right now the government is inept, or they can't balance a budget, or a lot of gridlock and Joe Manchin is stopping stuff, if they understood that austerity is a policy choice, and a lot of this stuff is intentional, I think it would light the fire for people to get radicalized to do something about it, more than, I guess, just vote or think they can tell their congressperson. But that's my opinion. One of the things that I took from this book too is that monetary policy and monetary operations and things like overnight interest rates and treasury bond sales is just outdated, obsolete stuff from the gold standard era that, now is just basically a way for rich people to multiply their wealth. But I think it's intentionally kept confusing and boring. And, in the era of 10-second attention spans, I think a lot of people just start tuning out because they think it's just this complex nonsense they don't understand. It's just accounting. It's just keystrokes, moving numbers from one place to another. And like said in the earlier chapters, balance is balance. Alrighty, so here we go. I'm sure you hang around RP headquarters. You are familiar with our guest tonight, and he needs no introduction, but I'll give him a little one. Randall Wray is a professor of economics at Bard College and senior scholar at the Levy Economics Institute. Written a lot of books, done a lot of lectures, put out a lot of quality content and resources. And Dr. Wray gives legitimacy to the movement. He almost makes it less of a fringe thing, and gives us a lot of good resources to share with people, and it's legit stuff. And man, also the greatest beard in MMT since Bill Black. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. L. Randall Wray, the floor is yours, sir.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just say a couple words about each chapter. As I was saying before it was opened up to the audience, chapter 6 is on framing, And that actually is the first part of the book that I wrote. I wrote it a long time ago as a series of several blogs on Stephanie Kelton's New Economic Perspectives blog. Stephanie and I both were reading Lakoff at the time and realized that we had to talk about framing and we had to try to get the framing better. So I always tell the story of Robert Heilbroner. When I wrote the first draft for the 1998 book, which was the first academic book on what became MMT, Warren Mosler had written a little pamphlet before that called Soft Currency Economics. Anyway, I sent the draft to Heilbroner, who I had met once, but he didn't know who I was. I asked if he could write a little blurb for the book jacket. Publishers like that. I'm not positive it sells books, but anyway. So I thought I'd try him because he's probably either number one or number two in terms of the most economics books sold in English language. The other would be John Kenneth Galbraith. And I just got a phone call out of the blue from Heilbroner. And he said, "You've asked me to write a blurb on your book, which is about money. And this is something I cannot do. Money is the scariest topic there is. And your book is going to scare the hell out of everybody." And so he did not write the blurb. But so I joke that we've been scaring people ever since. And part of the reason it's scary is because we weren't taking account of the way the brain works. And Lakoff is the one who explained how it works. We tell stories, we use metaphors, and these memes actually take a physical presence in your brain. And when you hear a word, it will trigger the meme, sort of like a virus. And the problem is that most of the terms we use in economics suit the conservative frame, almost certainly on purpose. And so the conservative talks about the free market. We all love freedom. And about choice. We think we like choice. And of getting the government off our backs. And Lakoff talks about the parental figures that are both have positive connotations, but also negative connotations because your parents constrain you. And so they've already got all of these terms. The government runs a deficit. Well, I found out, a long time ago that the average American, average person in the street has no idea what a budget deficit is. Usually they confuse it with the trade deficit. Okay. It means that we're buying more from China than we sell to China. But the one thing they do know is a deficit is a bad thing. It means you're deficient. Our government is deficient in some very important way. And so, we would explain the way that we view a deficit and argue that there's nothing wrong with this. We can't run out of money. And, if the government ever needs more, all it has to do is keystroke more money, which is a perfectly good description of the way a modern government spends. It's all keystrokes. They can't run out. But when the average person hears that, that sounds immoral. The government's not paying for stuff. The government is just keystroking. That can't be right. It can't be moral for the government to do that. It should be constrained like we are in our income. Government can't spend without limit. That would be wrong. And so anyway, what I try to do in chapter 6 is to give us new ways of thinking about things. And Stephanie Kelton does this in her book too. So, don't call it a budget deficit. Call it a government spending surplus. The government is spending more, creating income for us. The so-called debt clock in Times Square is actually keeping track of all the wealth, financial wealth the government has created for us. The government doesn't take money out of our pockets. It puts money into our pockets. That's a really good thing. So that's an example of how you turn the tables and you use positive words that trigger good feelings in people's brains. And then you're not triggering the wrong ones. So that's chapter 6. Chapter 7 is really asking the question, has MMT made any headway? And I saw there were various comments being written in chat about the difficulty. Even if you win the debate and you get the framing right, the difficulty of turning the political system around so that it will actually try to serve the public purpose, broadly defined. And that is extremely difficult. Everyone who says this is difficult, you're all correct. We don't have the political will to do this, to do the kinds of things that most MMT proponents, who mostly are progressive, want to do. I don't see politicians as leaders. They're followers. Okay? But we can use that to our advantage. If we understand how things work, then every time Obama tells us the government ran out of money, you say, you're lying. We know you're lying. You need to stop it. We know that that cannot be true, and you know that too. You know that you're a liar. Call him out. Make him afraid to say silly things like that in public. It's been hilarious watching Paul Krugman over the years. He is, he's so confused and so wrong on virtually everything he says that has anything to do with macroeconomics. I think Krugman is pretty good on some things, but not on macroeconomics. And he's called out all the time. And he has to try to defend himself. And gradually over time, he's learned some things. He stopped saying things where he will, suddenly get 100 people commenting on his blog, telling him he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I think that is what is useful about teaching people who, don't have the kind of power that our politicians have, but who can try to hold them to their errors, point them out, and say, we're not going to take that anymore because we know that you are not telling the truth. I think I'll stop there.
All right. So we're going to get to the Q&A, and we're going to actually go to the CEO and founder of RP himself, Steve Grumbine, who has a question. I believe you're familiar with him, Dr. Wray.
Yep. Actually, I saw his question too.
All right, let's see. From Steve, do you feel that minting the platinum coin is the best way to move on the debt ceiling, or is there another MMT preferred way of expressing this?
I'm really not sure. Ron Gray had a little conference a couple weeks ago at Willamette, and I went, and I met the guy who pushed the law through in order to allow the mint, actually, to mint platinum coins of any denomination. And all along, he had in mind that this would be a source of finance for the Treasury. So the idea of selling coins to the Fed in order to get around the debt limit really is sort of the intention of the platinum coin. Back when the law was passed, he wasn't thinking of trillions of dollars. He was thinking of some billions of dollars that Congress would have without worrying about where's the money going to come from? Are we going to have to increase the tax rates? How are we going to get around pay-go? This was going to provide them with the capacity to spend without worrying about any of that stuff. And he is very gung-ho on trillion-dollar coins. And he believes that there's a pretty good chance, or very, very good chance, that the Treasury will do this. Now, all of the elected officials and appointed officials are saying they will never do it. They're not going to do it, that it's a gimmick and so on. I think it's very good that it's out in the open. People are discussing it and realizing that the debt limit is very silly. And some prominent people have come out and said that we ought to get rid of it. Probably most of you heard Yarmouth in interviews. He was the head of the House Budget Committee, saying that we should just raise it to $1 gazillion and then not worry about it anymore. Just one-time increase to some gazillion dollars, and we'll be good for the next few hundred years. So it helps to make it clear that there is no real spending constraint. This is a self-imposed constraint. We can find ways to get around the self-imposed constraint. So I would rather get rid of the debt limit. But as a last resort, hopefully the Biden administration will use it. I don't know the answer to that.
Our next question comes from actually one of the coolest people I know, and I met out in DC, Cheryl Van Apps.
Connie, John, that was really nice of you. I'm asking this question from a position. I'm a patient who is one of those high-cost patients, as they call them, in the legislation for Medicare for All. When I looked at the HR 1976 legislation text, it was written in the point of view they're looking at cost cutting. And to me, that means cutting services. I don't want to go into it, but it looks like the Senate, the newer version, 4204, is not. I'm just now going through it, and I'm really pleased at that. So that's where I'm coming from with this question. So theoretically speaking, could we write legislation with an open-ended amount of appropriations, write it as if it's mission-based to meet the public's needs?
Sure, absolutely. And we have programs essentially like that don't have dollar amounts attached to them. They are, I'm not an expert on the budgeting, but Stephanie is. But a large part of the budget is open-ended. So certainly we can do that. Unemployment compensation, for example, at the federal level is open-ended. So you just need to meet the requirement. And sometimes they loosen the requirements so that you can stay on unemployment compensation longer. So certainly we can write the bills that way, and that's a large part of the budget already. So, of course, MMT says overall budgeting is a good idea. There are some areas where you don't want to give unlimited budgets, like building freeways, building interstates, because with an unlimited budget, the transportation department is going to ramp up the spending. Your prestige and your pay is somewhat related to the number of people and projects that you're managing. And so there's a big incentive to pave the whole country if you give them an open-ended budget. But if you are, say, setting unemployment compensation, what matters is not the amount that you spend, but the requirements for receiving unemployment compensation. And the same would be true for medical care. It's not how much you spend, it's providing the treatment that's needed. So can they? Yes. Should they? Yes. It should be open-ended. Social Security is that way too. Now, part of the reason I was leaving that out is because you've all been taught that Social Security is paid for with payroll tax, which of course is nonsense. All the payroll tax does is reduce your take-home pay. That's all that it does. But we pretend like the payroll tax pays for Social Security, and they keep telling you, well, we're going to have to cut the benefits in about a decade because the revenue coming in is lower than the benefit payments because we have the baby boomers, and I guess we didn't plan well enough ahead of time. Well, that's all false. The Social Security can make all the payments as they come due. And we have set the conditions under which you qualify for Social Security, and also the formula for how much you will get on Social Security. That's all written into the law. It's always claimed that Congress would have to do something in order to, find the extra money, estimated to be about 1/4 of the benefits promised, in order to pay for that. But that's a self-imposed constraint.
Yeah, and I would go further and say that there's this idea. I remember working for the Bernie campaign, and one of the things was those darn Republicans have been stealing from the cookie jar of Social Security, and we got to get them to pay it back and stuff. And I told people this phone banking, and then when I listened to some of your lectures, read some stuff, it's like, Jesus Christ, it's all nonsense. It's totally solvent. And I think that's part of the thing that gets people pushing back against MMT is they see on their check minus, $100 for FICA or going to that. And it's like, well, I'm paying for this stuff. And they just can't wrap their mind around that it's not like that.
And Randy, we were working with a Medicare for All group, and they were at one point looking into ideal legislation. What would be ideal legislation, or how would they ask Congress or Senate to change whatever legislation is sitting in their offices now? And one of the questions that we got hung up on was taxes. The Physicians for a National Health Plan and the National Single Payer groups were insisting on progressive taxation being included in the bill. And I'm wondering, nothing wrong with progressive taxation if you got to have taxation, but I'm wondering, is there a way to word it so that, I know Stephanie talked about that we may need some offsets. We don't know what Medicare for All is going to require, but is there a way to word it that doesn't include taxation unless it's necessary? I just wonder if you have any ideas about that. I just don't like the idea of making it sound like, we got to raise taxes, pay for it, pay go, whatever. I'm wondering if there's another way that's realistic.
Medicare for All is probably going to reduce total medical spending by a substantial amount. And so Yeva and I have written on this. Rather than a tax increase, we might have to give a tax cut, because we're going to be taking a lot of spending out of the economy, spending on stuff we don't need. And that is, all the people between you and your doctor that are trying to prevent you from getting care. We're going to eliminate those people, the whole insurance sector, and they're going to have to go find something useful to do. So we might need to reduce taxes in order to expand aggregate demand so that they can find jobs doing something more useful than what they're doing now. So I can't envision that we need a tax increase if we move to Medicare for All. More likely we'll need a tax decrease. We might reduce Medicare medical care spending by somewhere between 3 and 5% of GDP. That's like a huge shock to the economy. So we'll give everyone a tax cut with their Medicare for All.
Great. I'm wondering if Yeva has anything to add to that. Do you have a suggestion about how to put that in legislation? How you would express it?
I don't really know. I think I would just say what Randy just said, that we think that just because government spending is going to go up, that has to be matched with taxes. That's the framing, right? But Medicare for All is a perfect example of you needing to give a tax cut because the overall spending in the economy is going down, because the government is now saying you cannot charge us, $300 for insulin, or we are not going to spend so much on administering the healthcare system. So that's where the savings are coming from. So you are actually withdrawing spending from the economy. No need to attach tax increases to that.
Think of all the insurance sector workers who are going to be laid off after this. Now, it's true, that households are going to have more take-home pay because they're not going to be spending the $12,000 a year as they're part of the coverage of the insurance that their employer is supplying. And so they're going to have more take-home pay. It could turn out that the hit to aggregate demand isn't as big. So I think the right way to proceed is to implement Medicare for all, maybe phase it in. Maybe your first step is to lower the age from 65 to 55 and then keep lowering it until we've got everybody in that pool. Transition to it. And if it turns out that aggregate demand does increase too much, then what we want to do is raise taxes at that time, or figure out where the inflation is coming from and try to tackle that part of the economy, rather than tying a progressive policy that you want to any kind of tax increase. Like I said in the book, that's like throwing barbells to a drowning swimmer. You don't need to throw something that is going to generate a whole bunch of opposition. Any kind of tax is going to raise opposition. Why tie that to a progressive spending proposal?
All right, we're going to go with Catherine Herbert next, and she wants us to read it for her. Why do MMTers not seem to support universal basic income?
So we generally have about 12 million people who want to work and can't find work. And so my first response would be, if somebody tells you what they want is a job, they want to do something useful, they want to contribute to society, you say, well, how about basic income guarantee instead? You say, but they want a job. Let's first give a job to anyone who wants to work. And then we're going to find that there are some people who don't want to work, cannot work, or should not work. And then let's deal with that. The job guarantee has a bunch of advantages over a basic income guarantee. And so for most of the population, the job guarantee is very much better for them as individuals, but also for our society as a whole. A job guarantee program is going to require much less spending by the federal government because we're targeting the spending to people who have not been able to find a job or have recently lost their job. And so we're talking maybe 12 million people on average, maybe 18 million in a recession as people lose their private sector jobs. And maybe it falls to 8 million in a very robust boom. That's a small fraction of the whole labor force. If, on the other hand, you look at what basic income guarantee from the very beginning had proposed to do, is to provide an income that is a reasonable alternative to working, so that people would not be forced to work. They could choose voluntarily not to work and collect basic income guarantee, and that it would be generous. In fact, that everybody's going to get it. That was the original proposal. And you would get a decent American living standard. Okay, then you're talking about $30,000 to $50,000 per person across the United States, depending on whether you include children or not. We could be up to 350 million people receiving this. Clearly, it's very much bigger. So then the argument is, well, but what we will do to make sure this isn't really inflationary is that we will tax everyone above some income level. And in order to make sure that the basic income guarantee doesn't add a lot of aggregate demand to the economy, we're going to have to tax them at double what we give them with the basic income guarantee. So if you give them 30,000, we have to tax them 60,000. And the reason for that is to offset the other half of the population that is below that median income level. And, all of a sudden, half of the population isn't getting anything with the basic income guarantee. It is actually losing with a basic income guarantee in order to prevent any inflationary pressure. Then you're going to lose a lot of support for the program. And the big argument for the basic income guarantee is that because everyone gets it, it's going to be just fabulously popular, because who's going to turn down $50,000 or whatever it is? So anyway, that is one problem with it. The other problem, so the size of the spending will be very different. And the other is that we see the job guarantee not only as something that provides jobs to anyone who wants to work, but also as a way to help stabilize wages and prices. It can't be inflationary by itself, because all it is doing is catching people that fall out of the labor market. It doesn't compete with the private sector. It is providing an alternative job, public option, as some people call it, that has a wage that's established with the law that creates the job guarantee program. And that will help to stabilize wages both on the upswing and also on the downswing. Wages can't fall below that wage. And when the economy does heat up, the private sector and other kinds of government jobs will pull people out of the job guarantee program. So it actually helps to stabilize wages, which helps to stabilize prices. So that's the main arguments. In addition, we can argue that the UBI people claim that what's going to happen is we're going to unleash all of this innovation and creativity because people won't have to take the kinds of jobs that Graeber was describing. I won't use his words, but you know what I mean. The crappy jobs. They won't have to take those crappy jobs because they will get the basic income guarantee and they can then become creative and so on. It's nice. That's a nice way to think about it. But we know from surveys what unemployed people do with all their extra time. And just to cut to the conclusion, they watch television and they sleep a bit more. Those are the activities that we find that actually occupy the time that people are not working. So it's nice to make these claims, but I think there are problems. Anyone who's interested, I have written all of this in a previous book, Great Leap Forward. I've gone through their claims. I've got the arguments that they made. I have the citations to their literature. Pavlina Cherneva and I have been arguing with the founders of the modern movement for almost 30 years. And I find most of their arguments implausible or mistaken.
Randy, you said that the jobs guarantee jobs are not supposed to compete with the private sector jobs. But in fact, if you're offering me $20 an hour with a job guarantee or 15 or whatever, and McDonald's is only offering me $7, then I'm going to stick to the job guarantee job. So that is competing. And my other question is, some people, Pavlina talks about this all the time, the kinds of jobs we can have as job guarantee jobs are the other side of the equation. They can really provide a service, things that the actual community needs. I always think when I lived in New York City of all the empty lots that could have been turned into public gardens or playgrounds or something, that would be a great job as a job guarantee job. The arts, there's so many things. Anyway, but the competition question is what I'm curious about.
When you implement the job guarantee program, whatever wage and benefit package and working conditions in those jobs will set a standard that the private sector has to meet or compensate you for. So if the job guarantee program has 2 weeks of paid vacation, as all you Americans know, we have no law that requires you to get paid vacation in the United States, and many employers don't provide any at all. We won't need the law, because as soon as the job guarantee program has a 2-week paid vacation, the private employers will either have to add that or pay you enough that you will accept not having a paid vacation. The same with healthcare. If it comes with healthcare, private sector will have to provide that. Okay. So whatever wage and benefit package is provided becomes the new minimum. And we would like this set at a living wage and with the kinds of benefits I'm talking about. So yes, you're right. As soon as you implement this, it has set a new standard. It's like raising the minimum wage. When you raise the minimum wage, or if you require paid parental leave for the birth of a new baby, that sets a new standard. And the job guarantee program will do that. So there is competition at the very beginning. I mean, it's not really competition. It's they meet it or they're out of business. And so some people have said, well, that sounds terrible. I even had a very progressive woman once when we were presenting at the Roosevelt Institute who was worried about her own business because she said, I couldn't possibly pay a living wage to my workers. And her business was in New York City. She said, I go out of business. She said, well, some business models should not survive. If your business model requires that you can only pay $7.50 an hour to people who live in New York City, that's not a business model that we want to support. A lot of jobs will disappear because that business model, it can't be successful. And I think that all jobs should pay a living wage. If they don't pay a living wage, they shouldn't exist.
I couldn't agree more. That's why I think a lot of private businesses are wholeheartedly against a federal job guarantee, because why would you want to compete with an entity that doesn't need a return on investment? There's unlimited funding. But I digress. I mean, we already have, like Grumbine always says, we have a basic income already. It's Social Security. Let's expand and target that better. And I think a UBI as a policy prescription makes it to where instead of universal health care, it's like, here's some money, go buy health care. And if you can't afford it, too bad, or whatever. And it just, again, it doesn't solve it. It's like putting a Band-Aid on cancer, but it gives the illusion as, hey, look we gave you money. Why didn't you go to the doctor, or whatever?
It's a subsidy for low wage employers. That's what it is. So I'm sure you've all, read the analyses of Walmart employees. They're on food stamps. Okay, why are they on food stamps? Because Walmart does not pay a wage that they can live on. So all you're doing is subsidizing low wage employers. And what I'm saying is put them out of business instead.
Agreed. All right. And our next question comes from Matt Pivovitz, friend of the organization. You're good to go.
Awesome. Well, hey, everyone. So my question has to do with 0% interest rates. So basically, MMT says because our government creates new money when we spend, they're effectively not competing for an existing bucket or sum of money. Therefore, the natural rate of interest would be 0. What do we say to people if they have a rebuttal or pushback stating that would cause problems with investment, maybe in the financial markets like asset price inflation? Is there a good way to counter that or other alternative explanation other than just what I said?
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and I hear it from people who work in financial markets who are worried about that. And so first, just the natural rate argument is that the national governments normally spend more than they receive in tax revenue. So we call it a deficit. I would like that we transition away from using that word because deficit, oh no, they're doing something wrong. No, actually, they're doing something right. They're spending more than they're taxing, and they're putting money in our pockets. That's a very good thing for them to do. But the implication for the banks is that their reserves will be increasing because every dollar that the government spends will lead to a dollar credit to some bank's reserves. Every tax that we pay leads to a dollar debit from some bank's reserves. So if the government is spending more than taxing, bank reserves are going up, and that will tend to push the interest rate down to zero unless the central bank pays interest on reserves, which is what they have been doing since 2009. So now we only push it down to the interest rate the Fed pays banks on reserves. So if the Fed didn't do that, it would be zero, and that's why we call it the natural rate. All right. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to borrow as zero. So it's only the interest rate that banks are getting on reserves, lending to each other. So other rates are going to be above zero, and they should reflect various kinds of risk, including the risk of default. So the interest rates for everyone else aren't going to go to zero. They'll go to zero on reserves. They'll go near to zero on government bonds that are short term, a bit higher on government bonds that are longer term. Should that be a permanent policy then? Keep interest rates at zero and other rates very low. The fear is that when rates are very low, there's a huge incentive to borrow at a very low interest rate and then to speculate in financial assets. And that leads to speculative bubbles in financial assets and also possibly in housing and real estate. So we get these bubbles of financial assets. What's the best way to prevent those bubbles from occurring? Is it to keep the interest rate high? Okay, so the Fed has been raising interest rates. It seems to have had an impact on the stock market. It had an impact on housing markets. Is that the right way to deal with speculative excess? I would say no, it's not. Lots of the speculation should just be outright plain illegal. They should not be permitted to do it. It should be jailable offenses, and virtually everything that has to do with the virtual reality coin scams should be illegal, and they should be going to jail. A huge part of the cause of the global financial crisis was various frauds by Wall Street, by the biggest banks. And a lot of it was illegal, but a lot of it wasn't illegal, but should have been illegal. So what I would say is, let's clamp down on the speculators rather than raising the interest rate and hoping that will dim the speculation because it becomes a little bit more expensive for them. Look, if you believe that you can get a 25% return by speculating in financial assets or commodities, raising the interest rate to 5 or 6% is not going to reduce the speculation. So let's tackle the problem directly instead of thinking that we can get rid of it by increasing the cost a little bit.
Right. Our next question is from Cag Lee, and he would like us to read it.
Yeah. Okay. It's my understanding that there are two types of accounts at the central bank. I'm unable to remember what they are called, but essentially checking and savings accounts. When Warren Mosler has been asked about the ramifications in the event that China sells all of its U.S. treasuries, his response has been that there are no ramifications. The money would just be moved by keystrokes from the interest-bearing account to a non-interest-bearing account. One of the ramifications for China would be their loss of interest income. The only thing we owe China is an account statement. So my question is, What does the national debt number actually include? Just the money in U.S. treasuries, interest-bearing accounts, or all the money deposited at the Fed, interest and non-interest-bearing accounts?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just answer the last part first. When they total up the government debt, they're only totaling up the bonds and bills. So they're not including cash, and they're not including what Warren was calling the checking account at the Fed, which we call reserves. So it's reserves that are held at the Fed that now earn a bit of interest, as I was saying before. Those are not included in the debt. So yes, if everyone who held a government bond, all the banks in the United States, all the banks around the world, and all individuals working through their banks decided that they didn't want to hold U.S. government bonds anymore, we could take that 33 trillion or whatever the number is now, $33 trillion of bonds, and change all of that to bank reserves. That is moving it out of the savings accounts into the checking accounts. And now the amazing thing is the Treasury wouldn't be paying any interest at all. It would be the Fed paying the interest. So the Fed would pay the interest on $32 trillion worth of reserves, although it's a very low interest rate. Okay, it's lower than what the bonds are paying. This would just simply be quantitative easing on a much bigger scale than what we saw after the global financial crisis. So that's what the quantitative easing was. The Fed bought back the bonds and credited people's checking account, and they get the interest rate paid by the Fed instead of by the Treasury. So there are some advantages of doing that. Is there any implication of China deciding to sell off their bonds? As Warren was saying, they're going to lose some interest income. There could possibly be some impacts on the dollar exchange rate. I say possibly. The theory is that if China started selling treasury bonds, you got to find buyers for them if the Fed doesn't buy them. And it could be that other global buyers wouldn't buy them unless the value of the dollar went down. This is the theory of the way things work. In reality, the dollar, we can't find things like that affecting the value of the dollar. So I think it's very unlikely that it would have much impact on the United States at all. So I think Warren's right, and he's definitely right if it's the Fed that just buys all the bonds and credits their the Chinese central bank's reserves.
Our next question comes from my brother from down under, Stephen D.
So 15 years ago in Australia, we paid off all the government debt and the budget was in surplus. Does that mean all the money in the economy was from bank lending?
Okay, I don't think you paid off all the government debt. It's true that you ran a surplus. We did too under President Clinton. When you're running a surplus, you can be reducing the size of the outstanding government debt.
We actually got down to no government debt except I left 50 billion in bonds because the financial market wanted it.
Okay.
They needed that interest rate. But other than that, all debt, absolutely all government debt was paid down.
Okay. In the United States, Clinton had said we would retire all of the government debt within 15 years. Okay. And economists and the Fed took this seriously. We didn't. But we said the budget surplus is going to destroy the economy. We're going to collapse into a deep recession. The budget deficit will come right back. Okay, which is what happened. But anyway, economists and the Fed took this seriously. And so just like you're saying, everyone was worried. What are we going to do if there's no government debt out there? What are we going to use as the really safe, default risk-free asset in our portfolios? The Fed held conferences on this, trying to figure out what they would use instead. And one of the answers was mortgage-backed securities. Because, everybody knows that in the United States, we do get housing bubbles in particular cities, particular states, and they crash, and the house prices fall, and those mortgages go bad. But we had not had a nationwide housing crash since 1929. Couldn't happen, and so because the advantage of the mortgage-backed securities is you package mortgages from all over the country into the security. The idea is you diversify the risks away, and there's no chance those things can go bad. Therefore, mortgage-backed securities are just as good as government bonds. And so the markets, because it looked like government bonds were going to disappear and we were running a surplus, they started stuffing their portfolios full of mortgage-backed securities. And this helped to lead to the global financial crisis because suddenly there weren't enough mortgage-backed securities to satisfy everybody. So they started securitizing worse and worse mortgages until they got to the point where they're securitizing mortgages that had no chance of ever making a single payment whatsoever. And then the whole thing fell apart. Okay. You're right. The markets are the ones that demand the government bonds. And so we have all this worry. The bond vigilantes will attack if the debt gets too big and so on. And then the Treasury has no problem selling the bonds. Every time there's a new bond issue, it's oversubscribed. The global markets want U.S. Treasury bonds. So we have this strange disconnect of people warning this can't continue. You can't continue to run deficits and put more bonds into the market. The vigilantes will go on strike. But the vigilantes are out there saying, hold on, we want the bonds. Don't take them away from us. So in some cases, when the Treasury ran surpluses and therefore we're not issuing new bonds, central banks issue the bonds because the market demands bonds. In China, the central bank issues bonds so markets can accumulate safe bonds when the national government is not issuing enough to satisfy the markets.
James Keenan, are you there, sir?
Okay. So this is a comment from which I'm soliciting a response from Randy. In Chapter 6 of Making Money Work for Us, you argue that we have to reframe the public discussion about money, deficits, and debt so as to capture the moral high ground. You then go on to recommend one particular way of reframing the concept, we take care of our own, as suggested in a 2012 Bruce Springsteen song. And you suggest several memes based on this concept. I fully agree with you about capturing the moral high ground and reframing the debate, but I confess I have qualms about the particular concept you're suggesting. On the one hand, we take care of our own suggests a more communitarian approach to politics. But on the other hand, over the course of my life, I've often heard people say about an ethnic group other than their own, those people, they take care of their own. And this most often appears as an anti-Semitic trope. I could also imagine that this trope could get twisted into, we take care of our own, but we don't take care of the others, those who are not our own. I also watched the video of the Springsteen song, and I found it a bit too flag-waving for my tastes. So while I'm fully on board with your search for good political messaging for MMT, I'm more dubious about the particular message that you suggest in Chapter 6. Reaction?
Our own means all of us. We're all in it together. I talk about the pandemics that we face. as humans, but even beyond humans. The pandemics of COVID is one, climate catastrophe is another, rising seas of refugees, climate refugees, war refugees, of inequality, racism, of fascism. These are all pandemics we face. We face them all together. We cannot possibly solve these, even a country at a time. We all have to work together. And understanding MMT makes this much easier. A country like the United States faces no financial constraints, either domestic or abroad. Now, that's not true of most countries. We argue MMT does apply to developing countries. And Yave and I wrote a piece for another book that just came out on this, the problem that they face. So domestically, they can use their own currency to mobilize their resources, but they don't have the resources to deal with these kinds of problems that I'm talking about, and problems that for the most part, they did not cause. Okay. It's not the small developing countries that have caused climate change. It's the rich countries that have caused climate change. But the small countries are the ones who are already facing disaster because of what we did. Okay, now, they don't have sovereignty externally. They can't spend their own currency to mobilize foreign resources because, for the most part, other countries around the world don't want to accumulate assets denominated in their currencies. The U.S. is not in that situation. Britain's not in that situation. China increasingly is not in that situation. Our currencies can mobilize foreign resources. And what that means is that we can help. We have the capacity, the financial capacity to afford to help the developing nations take on these multi-pandemics that we all face together. And because we can't run out of money, and because we realize the only constraint the only constraints are the resources and the know-how. Okay, for the most part, we seem to have the know-how. I'm not that kind of scientist, but Yeva, especially Yeva, did most of the reading on greening the economy. It seems like we pretty much have the technical know-how to do it. Resources, we don't have all the resources we need, but we can start to build them in order to tackle the pandemics. But we certainly have all the money that we need. And there's no problem for us donating as much money as necessary to help developing nations to start to tackle their various pandemics. But how do we operate in the world? So the U.S. promises foreign aid. We never live up to what we have promised. And what we promise is extremely small, 1% of GDP or something like that. And the reason why we don't live up to it is because we think we can't financially afford it. But that's not the question. The question is whether we can find the resources to do it, or whether they can find the resources to do it. Money is not the problem. So we can provide the funding as long as they locate the resources in order to tackle their pandemic. So I think that that's how MMT helps. And the definition of us has to be inclusive. Selfishness is not going to work. We found when the pandemic first hit, and you remember what the rich countries did. They all hoarded the masks, and then they hoarded the vaccines. And what good did that do us? it's always going to blow back and hit us. If we don't help deal with the refugees or the processes that are generating the referees, the blowback hits us. So we are all in it together, and we have to realize that.
Yeah, we're all on the same bus. Nobody gets off the planet.
This is Aditya in Boston. So yeah, first of all, thanks, Randy. I've listened to a lot of your material over the last couple of years. It's been really a major part of my education in MMT. I'm not entirely clear between the terms like inflation versus relative prices. I don't know. It sometimes isn't even clear to me if maybe people are using it totally in a precise way. So I'd really appreciate hearing you kind of comment or expound on the difference between these two terms. Maybe also describing what factors in the world are most important for modulating each, inflation versus relative prices. And also if you have any good advice for how we should use those terms properly.
Okay. Well, the mainstream focuses on relative prices, and those are supposed to efficiently allocate the resources among scarce resources among competing uses. So I don't want to use the term that way, but inflation is based on a price index. It's a human construction. You make lots of decisions when you go about constructing a price index. And so we have two, the CPI and the PCE, that are very commonly used. They're both constructed indexes. They have made choices, and some of those choices are very strange. So, for example, if you look at U.S. high inflation periods, they have always been driven by three items in the consumer basket. One is oil, and that won't shock anybody, that when oil prices quadruple, it has a big impact on the measure of inflation, because oil goes into the production of virtually everything that we buy, or at least the transportation. Okay, the second is food. Well, the food price is 70% determined by oil. So that's not too strange either. If oil prices go up, food prices are going to go up, because basically when you eat food, you are eating oil, literally, because it's in the fertilizers, the pesticides, but then they also have to operate the machinery and transport the food. So those two items. The third one is a strange one. It's shelter services. And this is supposed to capture all of the joy you get from living with a roof over your head. Okay. And a very large part of that in America is the owner occupied equivalent rent, which is an imputed price. It doesn't exist, because if you own your own home, I mean, even if you still owe the mortgage loan, you live in a home that you own, your mortgage payment, some people have floating rate mortgages, but fixed are the most common, or you've already paid off the mortgage. That price is not going up. Okay. But what they do is they impute a rent that you would get if you had to rent something equivalent to the home that you're living in. And that can move in very strange ways that have nothing to do with what is going on in the housing market. That is the market for newly built homes. The shelter component is 40% of the consumer basket, and the owner-occupied portion is maybe 25%, so a quarter of the consumer basket. And that is what tends to drive inflation. And it's not even a market price. It's not a price that you're paying. Then if the Fed reacts to that, which it has just done, reacts to the inflation, with a lot of that being driven by the shelter component, they raise interest rates. Well, now think about what's going to go on in the housing market. In the United States, we have a severe housing shortage because hardly any homes have been built. since the housing bubble burst. So we have a housing shortage. We have a homelessness pandemic of homelessness all over the country, and a shortage of rental units. And rental prices are going up. Rising rental prices go into that imputed, which makes the inflation look even worse when rental units are going up. We had a moratorium on rents, but we got rid of that at the supposed end of the pandemic. So anyway, you got all these strange things going on. The Fed raises interest rates. How is that going to affect the market for new rentals and new homes? Well, the builders have to pay interest for all the materials they're using to build homes, and all the buyers have to pay a much higher mortgage rate. And so you don't get a lot of homes built, and you don't get new multifamily dwellings built. And so the shortage isn't relieved. So you're not going to reduce the inflation pressure coming from the housing component by raising the interest rate. You're going to make it worse. So you get this crazy problem because of the way the index is constructed. A lot of countries include the interest payments on your home in the measure of inflation, and we did too. But then it becomes even more obvious when the central bank raises the interest rate target, which raises the mortgage rates, that raises inflation. So the Fed fights inflation by causing more inflation. That's why we switched to the other way of measuring it, I think in the early 80s. But it still is a bizarre thing. It's not reflecting market prices at all. So what I'm saying is a large part of the measured inflation rate is due to the peculiar way that we measure the inflation rate. And you get the wrong policy. Even if you believed that monetary policy is the correct way to fight inflation, you're getting the wrong signals and possibly the wrong impacts on the inflation rate. I personally would not use monetary policy to fight inflation. That probably isn't where you wanted me to go. That's my answer.
Yeah, I think you say it all the time that the Fed doesn't have the tools to fight inflation. So why do we expect they're going to? But all right, our next question is from Gonzalo.
Yes, hello. My name is Gonzalo from Argentina. First of all, excuse my English. This is a bit of a technical question. And the other day I was debating with a friend of mine who was the vice president of our central bank. And I was explaining him how when the Treasury issues bonds, it's just a reserve drain, as Warren always says. And I think that the book also says that. But he tells me, well, what happens if the Treasury would issue a paper bond saying, I owe you blah, 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 and it collects the money in a private bank account, and the deposit shifts from the buyer to the Treasury account, and the reserves shifts from the buyer to the Treasury. I don't see that the reserve drain there, and I know that doesn't make much sense, but I don't know why exactly.
Well, so the Treasury sells bonds, and in the United States, anybody can buy U.S. Treasury bonds. You go online to treasurydirect.gov, and you can buy Treasury bonds. You think that you're paying for them with your demand deposit, your checking account. You see the money disappear out of your checking account. You think that you have paid the Treasury, but that's not true. I can't say for certain the way that it works in Argentina, but in the United States and the countries where other MMT people have investigated, the Treasury cannot write checks on a deposit at your bank, at your private bank. So they can't just move deposits out of your account into the Treasury's account, and then the Treasury can spend that. That's not the way that it works. Your banks' reserves will be debited and the Treasury's account at the central bank will be credited. So that's the way it works. So reserves are withdrawn from the banking system. Now, in the United States, we do have these special tax and loan accounts where the Treasury does keep deposits, but it cannot write checks on those. It can't spend them. It's got to move them to the Fed in order to spend them. And that is when the reserves are withdrawn. And the only reason they have the tax and loan accounts really is it has nothing to do with Treasury spending. It had to do with timing of the loss of reserves for the banks. It was to avoid negative impacts on the private banks. That's why they did it. It's not that those accounts the Treasury holds in private banks can be used in any way by the Treasury. So I'm not sure what your central banker is trying to argue. I'll tell you what, just the other day, I was looking for some old class notes because I had to give a lecture on a topic. I was pretty sure I had notes. I came across my lecture notes from 1990. Okay, why does that matter? Well, I met Warren Mosler in 96. So it was long before Mosler. And I was teaching my class at University of Denver, and I had all the balance sheets, and I showed exactly how the Treasury spends. And you increase the bank reserves, and then the bank increases the deposit account of the recipient of the Treasury spending. And then I showed what happens with the bond sale. It reduces the reserves in the private banks. And what I'm saying is that anybody who had never heard of MMT, never heard of Warren Mosler, would have come to exactly the same conclusion, just working through the balance sheets. And that's why when Warren said it, bond sales are just a reserve drain. I thought about it. I thought about the balance sheets, but I had never thought of it the way that he was thinking of it. Therefore, it's not a borrowing operation. It's only a reserve drain. It's functionally exactly the same as an open market sale of bonds by the Fed, which was his point. Why do we call that one a fiscal operation? It's not a fiscal operation. It is a reserve draining operation, so it's part of monetary policy. Okay, so that was the insight of Warren. But anyone who can work through very simple balance sheets, and you would hope your central banker can do that. If they can't work through balance sheets, you're probably in trouble. Anyone would come to the same conclusion. This cannot be argued. It's true. Oh, Yeva has her hand up.
Yeah, I think what the central banker was trying to say is that they do have the tax and loan accounts. Okay. So then in situations when they're not transferring it to the Treasury's account at the Fed, then the reserves are not drained. And that's accurate, right? So that is true. You can sell bonds and not drain reserves. And that's the whole point of having those tax and loan accounts, which are not used anymore in the United States, was to keep the reserves and not drain them. Because when you drain them, you have impacts on interest rates, which happened sometime, I think it was in September of 2019, when they had all these Treasury issues and then tax payments by corporations, because that's when the second tax deadline in October. And then there was a shortage of reserves. And so the interest rates skyrocketed and the Fed quickly intervened. So yeah, sure, you can leave the reserves in the system, but the question is, why would you want to do it? And the only reason is to leave them there to avoid impacts on interest rates. And then when you're ready to spend, that's when you take them out and then you inject them back in with the spending.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the greatest things about MMT. It's simple once you get down to the basics. Paul Burtwell, you have a question?
Hi, thank you. Dr. Wray, I really enjoyed chapter 6 and overall this book. I read both Understanding Money and your primer. But my question was, with regarding that framing that you pointed to in chapter 6, do you consider that personally what's responsible with the tremendous success of the Koch libertarians in creating this sort of self-loathing working class, right, that has been convinced that for a lifetime of servitude, hey, your government doesn't owe you anything. And then they've convinced everybody to take these things that kingdoms in the past would never bequeath to the nomadic warrior tribes that were market based, right? That was part of the infrastructure. And these people are just begging when you go out and try to train and educate, they're just begging for their own doom. And then when you ask them for proof of their claims, they supply the equivalent of a picture of Daffy Duck. Is this what you really attribute to the success? I mean, what they've been able to convince them is down is up. It's unbelief.
Yeah, Lakoff is the expert. And so I'm just summarizing what I learned from him. So his argument is that, yes, conservatives understand all this. They embraced this notion of framing, and they are extremely good at it. And that's why they have won all of the debates, all the political debates since the days of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And unfortunately, the liberals, he's very focused on the Democratic Party. They don't understand it. And they use the conservative framing. The conservative framing dominates even among the liberals. And that's why they lose. That's his argument. It's because they've adopted the same framing. Deficit is scary. And if you use the words that they've used, like I was saying, freedom, how can anyone be against a free market? It sounds so nice. And contrast that to the government and planning and government control, government controlling us, that they're going to win as soon as you open your mouth when you start talking that way. Yeah, someone just wrote pay for it. It's the Democrats that insisted on bringing back the pay for. In 2010 and 2011, they insisted on bringing back pay-fors. A couple of years ago at the Eastern Economic Association meetings, my wife presented a paper that we had done together, which is MMT framework. And she presented it while I sat outside the door watching our child. And I couldn't really hear what was going on. The door was closed. Until after she was done, I heard someone in the audience yelling, "But you got to pay for it." And the guy who was yelling was a UMass, progressive, far left-wing, quasi-Marxist, heterodox economist, because I know his voice. He was the one who was insisting, "No, you got to pay for it." So anyway, that is a huge problem.
All right, next up, we have Stephen Cobb.
Okay, great. I have a follow-on question about the market for treasuries. If we eliminated the sale of government securities and bought back all the existing debt, where would the private sector park its money in a risk-free vehicle? I'm thinking here about, wealthy individuals, corporations, pension funds, and so forth. Would it be best to have zero interest treasuries?
Now, I'm speaking for myself. We don't all agree on this. I think both Bill Mitchell and Warren Moser would just say, but why give them risk-free? Let them take risks if they want to earn anything. And so they would eliminate bonds, as far as I understand them. My view is I see a role to continue to offer government bonds, but I would target them. And so some of you might be as old as me, and you remember when you were in grade school, and at the end of the week, you would take a quarter to school, and they had these slotted cardboard pieces that you could put your quarter in. And when you got an 1875, you got a U.S. savings bond that would be worth $25 if I remember right, 7 years later. Why don't we do that? Okay, let's offer savings bonds to kids. Let's offer government bonds to everyone whose family income is under $100,000 a perfectly safe asset, and let's give them a good return. It doesn't have to be market determined. Congress can set it. And, where do we set it? Well, we set it where it will encourage saving among low-income people in a perfectly safe asset with a good return for them so that they don't have to go to Bitcoin or to Wall Street and have thieves steal their savings. Let's give them a safe alternative. It's in the public interest. I also would do it as long as we have private pension plans where it is one of the legs of the stool. I mean, ideally, I would like to move beyond that and have a full, generous Social Security that is sufficient for everybody so that we don't need pensions. But we're a long way from transitioning toward that. So let's also allow pension funds to hold those. Again, instead of putting their money into private equity, which is what they're doing now, and then that private equity buys out firms and lays the workers off. So your own pension fund is eliminating your job and then also taking risky bets that are almost certainly going to lose money for the pension funds. So I would say pension funds, probably insurance, life insurance, where what they need is a sort of a portfolio with a base that is very safe and long-term. And then, and any manager of a pension fund will tell you that then they can take some risks with some of the fund to try to get a better return. So I would do that. Pick which kinds of institutions and which kinds of households would be allowed to purchase these special U.S. Treasury bonds in order to get a good, safe return. So that's my view. You don't sell bonds just to drain reserves, just to allow anybody to earn a return on something that is riskless in terms of default risk. Keynes's argument was that we should drive the risk-free interest rate to zero. Okay, so what Bill and Warren are saying is perfectly consistent with Keynes's recommendation too. I'm just saying there could be a public purpose in offering very safe savings bonds or to serve the public purpose.
Yeah, almost like I have any risk at all. It's a public retirement program funded by the federal government. Okay, we are going to go to Tom Clark. He wants us to read it for him. Tom asks, says FICA/MCR taxes are portrayed as hypothetical, earmarked taxes. I get that this isn't really true, but does that mean there's no such thing as a hypothecated federal tax? Not sure what that is.
Neither am I, and I'm not sure what the second acronym was. What was MCR? I don't know what it is.
Tom, if you're available.
Thank you. Yes, I think hypothecated tax is what the British call their NHS tax, and it's earmarked. And so what I meant by the FICA MCR, the payroll tax is all I meant. Maybe I should have written that.
Okay. All right, I got it. Okay, it doesn't go anywhere. When they take it out of your pay, it's gone. The government just burns tax revenue. It doesn't go. Now, I know what they tell you. They tell you, well, we're running a surplus. This really got a big boost back under President Reagan. The Greenspan Commission, it's the same Greenspan before he headed the Fed. He was the head of this commission to look at Social Security, and they said, hey, you know what? We had a baby boom, and someday these people are going to retire. And they ran projections, and they said that with the current payroll tax rate and a growing group of elderly people who will be retiring, the tax revenue won't match the benefit payments going out. And so what should we do? Now, this is something that was going to happen in the future. It wasn't happening already in the Reagan years. They said, well, let's raise the tax rate, but let's raise it way more than we need now, and we'll accumulate a surplus. And then later, we can run down that surplus when the tax revenue falls below the benefit payments. And they increased the tax rate to the rate they thought they would build a big enough surplus to get us through the whole retirement of the baby boomers, okay, my generation. And so we're about halfway through that right now. But eventually they're all going to be dead. So you don't have to worry about them once they're dead, right? So it's a limited amount of time, and they thought they had resolved it. And now here we are almost 50 years later. Well, actually it is 50 years later. And the projections now show that in about a decade, we will have run out of the surplus. We will have converted all of the bonds that the Social Security accumulated over that whole period of time when tax rates were too high relative to benefit payments. Now we're going to use up all that surplus, and we find out that we're going to run short. It's not because they miscounted the number of seniors. It is because they use increasingly pessimistic assumptions about the future, that we're going to grow slower than we have in the past, and that people will retire as they have done in the past, even though we have an extended lifespan. And what do people say? 70 is the new 60 or whatever. Aged people have stayed in the workforce longer, and so on. All right. What did they do with the surplus? They bought U.S. Treasuries. And so it's the Treasury owing itself. It didn't give them anything that they can spend. They can turn the Treasuries back to the Treasury, but the Treasury has to finance itself by selling the Treasuries on to you. So it didn't do anything at all. We are doing exactly what we would have done if there had been no surplus. The only difference is that they wouldn't have been taking 3 or 4% extra out of your paycheck these past 50 years. You would have had more money to spend. It didn't change anything regarding the way the finances will be run with a surplus or the way the finances will be run without a surplus. It just made no difference. And besides, of course, the Treasury doesn't spend the tax revenue anyway. All that taxes do is reduce your take-home pay, and the spending is just keystroke credits to bank accounts. We could have made all the payments as they come due. It's very funny because after Greenspan headed this commission, came up with this solution, then before Congress, Paul Ryan was grilling him about Social Security, and Ryan thought he was going to get the answer he wanted out of Greenspan. Well, Social Security is going to go bankrupt, right? And Greenspan said, no. The government can make all payments as they come due. We just use keystrokes, right? If he had answered that way in 83, we wouldn't have had the tax increase, because what he's saying is it doesn't make any difference. We can make all the payments. So the FICA tax is not used to make the Social Security payments. Why did Roosevelt set it up this way? So it all goes back to the New Deal. Roosevelt was afraid of being called a socialist and of the program being called socialism. That's why it was set up this way, based on the fiction that the tax pays for Social Security benefits. And when the system was set up, an extremely low tax rate raised an amount of revenue equal to the benefit payments, because the number of workers relative to the number of aged was very high. And by the way, why did they set retirement age at 65? Because most American workers would never make it. They would never get on Social Security. Skip forward a few decades, and the age to working population has grown a lot. Plus, we added lots of new beneficiaries to the program. The original program didn't have spouses, didn't have children, didn't have people with disabilities. And we have added all of those groups to the program. The original program didn't have agricultural workers and government employees. We added all of those to the program. So the number of beneficiaries has gone up a lot. And now if you try to match the two, you need higher and higher tax rates, which plays into the hands of the enemies of Social Security, because, of course, people don't like paying the payroll tax. It's not a good tax. It's a tax on work. It's a tax on your employer. Your employer has a huge incentive to reduce the workforce and replace you with a robot on which he doesn't have to pay payroll tax. And the tax is regressive above the $140,000 a year or whatever it is now. There's zero tax on the worker who makes high wages above that cap. And so it's not a progressive tax is what I'm saying. It's a flat tax up to that point, but overall it's regressive. It's taking more from low to middle income people and a lower percentage from high income people. And then finally, of course, it's only on labor. So we're not taxing profits. We're not taxing rent. We're not taxing interest. It's not a good tax. But we were sold on the idea that this is what pays for Social Security.
Indeed. All right, Kenny, you're up.
Hello. Actually, I think this may be a good transition into my question from where that last one ended up. Talking about taxes, and I know, throughout the book, you talk about how taxing frees up resources for movement into the public sector. And I was thinking, as kind of reading that, like you say, like income taxes are the way they are, but basically like spending itself is actually what causes inflation, because if that is the most direct way that we use the resources, right? When you buy something, you're using resources to get the things that take to use that thing, that then income taxes are a less direct way of controlling how those, manipulating or whatever, how those resources are used. So would a sales tax more directly allow the resources to be kind of controlled that way to free them up for public use? I know generally sales taxes are not necessarily seen as good because they discourage spending, which can grow the economy. And I have no horse in the race on taxes or anything, so it's a genuine question.
Okay. Well, so, in an ideal world, you can use a consumption tax, a sales tax. So it's a tax on consumption to try to reduce spending and prevent inflation, reducing aggregate demand. And under some conditions, you could design it to work in the same way that the income tax works and be progressive. The biggest argument against the sales tax is it's hard to make it progressive. So you can make it a little bit more progressive if you exempt, basic food, clothing and shelter, if you exempt that from the sales tax. But it's much harder to make it highly progressive than an income tax is. So with an income tax, you can increase the marginal rates and you can have that go up sharply as income goes up so that you are reducing inequality. That's the biggest argument against using the consumption tax, I think. But as far as inflation fighting goes, what I raise this question in the book, and Yave and I raise it in the pieces we've done on the Green New Deal. How do you prevent inflation? The problem is, what tax rate would you have to put on someone like Musk or Gates to affect their spending? It's going to be high. I don't know, 99% tax rate to have any dent in their consumption spending. So politically, it's very, very difficult to use the income tax or a sales tax. What sales tax would be required to reduce their spending? So you probably need a variety of taxes to accomplish a variety of goals. We know from the ProPublica investigation that lots of rich people don't have any income on purpose because they don't want to pay the income tax. So they have a lot of wealth, and what they do is borrow against their wealth. And you don't have to pay a tax on your spending out of wealth. You don't have to pay an income tax on that. So we need to be very clever. We need a very high wealth tax. Say it should approach 99% at the very top. That tackles the inequality problem. Probably doesn't do much for the inflation problem. You want to reduce certain kinds of spending when you're getting inflation pressure in those areas, and maybe a tax could play some role. You want to tax bad behavior. You want to tax pollution. You want to tax sin. So you need various kinds of sin taxes to do that. In some cases, you want to allocate costs to users. So, for example, we have a gas tax, a gasoline tax, and that's primarily to allocate costs of building the highways to the users. Does the government really need the money? No, they don't. But basically what we're saying is, especially to the big trucks, okay, you want to run a truck on the highway, and it takes a lot of resources, plus a lot of government spending, including state and local governments that are constrained in their spending. To build those highways for you, we have to overbuild them in order to allow the trucks to run on them. I used to work in the engineering department in the county, and the engineers told me 90% of the wear and tear of the road was due to trucks, not to the cars. So anyway, there's a lot of costs associated with running the trucks, and it's not really that the federal government needs the money, but we want to put those costs on the truckers because we have a viable alternative to the trucks, which is the railroads. And so we want to make it more expensive so that we'll reduce the incentive to shutting down the railroads and putting everything on the highways. So you can see there, even though money's not the government's problem, you might want to put costs on certain activities to get them to make better choices than they otherwise would make. So lots of reasons to have taxes, and we probably need a wide variety of taxes. I think I saw Henry George mention the Henry George tax is a good tax, but I wouldn't be satisfied with one tax.
Absolutely. Tax the rich because we don't need their money. They're just too rich, too much political power. Randy is up next, and he wants us to read his question. Randy asks, do banks still borrow overnight reserves from the Fed?
Well, they could in a pinch. After quantitative easing, we have just put so much excess reserves into the banking system that there are plenty of reserves available for lending. Now, once in a while, we've had these strange hiccups in the overnight market, and the interest rate has gone way above the central bank's target in the UK and in the US. So there's something strange going on, even though there's massive excess reserves in the banks. But if a bank needs more reserves than they got, they can borrow first from other banks in the overnight market, and then second turn to the central bank if there aren't available funds in the overnight market. Or what central banks have tended to do is move away from using what's called the discount window, which is where banks directly borrow from the central bank, to the central bank just buying more bonds to put more reserves into the private market, and then banks lend the reserves to each other. If we go back before quantitative easing, then banks, could easily come up short, and they would borrow in the overnight market. And if you go back to when the Fed did supply a lot of reserves at the discount window, you would tend to find that a huge proportion of the borrowing from the Fed was sort of longer term. It would be day after day banks that were borrowing, and they tended to be troubled banks. They were banks that weren't really trusted by the other banks, and it was more of a lender of last resort sort of thing. But central banks have really moved away from the discount window and to buying bonds to put reserves into the system. My professor, Hyman Minsky, always opposed this. He said that the central bank should force them to come to the discount window, because that allows the central bank to look at their books and see if they're in trouble, and see why they're having trouble borrowing reserves in the overnight market from other banks. Why don't other banks trust them? Maybe the other banks know something about their balance sheet, and that is the way that we can keep a check on them. Unfortunately, and he used to debate this at the Fed, at the Board of Governors, and unfortunately he lost. The Fed said, "No, we don't want to do that. We don't want to look at their books. We want the market to operate. And so we'll just put the reserves into the market and let the market decide who can borrow and who will discipline a bank that is getting itself into trouble," which sort of explains why we had a global financial crisis.
Randy, thank you so much. John, I know you want to say that's the truth, but we believe it. Thank you. Randy, when is your illustrated book coming?
Okay. So originally, this book started out to be the cartoon book, but there were just too many words, and there was no way to get this book down to a size that made any sense. So with Hesky Van Duren, who was a Levy Economics master's student graduate, it turns out she's a very good artist. And so she and I put together a cartoon book that has very few words and very great cartoons that she drew that explains all of the basics of MMT for the people that, find this book too difficult. And hopefully we're going to get it into the classrooms. I don't mean college. I mean into junior high and high school and possibly elementary school classrooms as a way to introduce students to MMT at an earlier stage. And it should be out in March.
March. Great. The other thing that's happening in March, on March 23rd to 25th, is the conference at Willamette in Oregon called Public Money in the Future. Are you going to be there?
Yes. Yeva's presenting too. Both of us will present. It's about half economists and half people who come more from law, from public policy. Rowan Gray is one of the organizers. He's done the most work on organizing. And the focus will be on public banks. Probably many people have heard of state banks and the movement for states to found their own banks. So those topics will be discussed there. And I think it's going to be online. I'm not positive.
Yeah, actually, we're going to be streaming it at Real
Okay.
Quick. So I'm sure other people will too, but we are definitely. This was terrific. Thank you, John, for hosting. And be sure to listen to Macro and Cheese. It's released every Saturday morning at some ungodly hour like 8 a.m. Eastern. But since it's not live, you can listen to it anytime on any podcast platform. Thank you so much.
Night, guys. See you soon.